Member for Prahran.
Thank you, Speaker. And I rise to join this grievance debate to grieve for all those Victorians who are experiencing issues with housing, whether that's people experiencing homelessness, living on the streets, and as I always point out, for those people living on the streets, as everyone would be well aware, is just the tip of the iceberg for those people who are experiencing homelessness. There's always so many more people who are in insecure housing or insecure accommodation that may not be safe. And whilst there has been an increase in visible homelessness, people living on the streets, incredibly, and I'll just point out, incredibly disappointing that I am speaking about homelessness, which is a serious issue. When I raise this at public forums across my electorate, everyone across the board understands this issue. We're very disappointed that the member for Essendon would seek to interject at this particular moment. I'm also grieved for those people, not just homelessness, for those people across the housing spectrum who are, whether it's struggling with housing affordability, whether it's struggling in rental accommodation. We know in the rental system people really don't have the rights that they should have. They're facing high rents and increase in rents, making it harder to live where they want to live. People who are locked out of buying their first home, locked out of home ownership, and what really is essentially a rigged housing system. I know the term rigged system has entered the political lexicon of late, and it's used across the board, but I think when you look at the housing market and the housing system, it's an inescapable conclusion that it really is a rigged system that favours people who are buying their second, third or fourth home over those who are just trying to enter the housing market. So, and I do want to start off with my remarks around housing affordability and lend my support to the federal tax changes that are being proposed by the federal Greens, and that is ending negative gearing and ending the capital gains tax discount on investment properties. Now, the Greens were the first party that was courageous enough to propose these changes, and I'm really glad to see that there's some other parties now adopting this policy too. For our proposal, which is to phase out negative gearing and closing off the scheme to new entrants and phasing out the capital gains tax breaks, it really will tip the scales much more in favour of first homeowners, first home buyers rather than investors, while actually improving the budget bottom line. I mean, it's just diabolical at the moment now when federal tax receipts, revenues still haven't reached the level that they have following the GFC, that we would be spending billions of dollars in tax breaks for investors at a time when people are being locked out of home ownership. The other tax change that I think we really do need to discuss as well and needs to be seriously considered is the replacing of stamp duty with land tax, which when you look at what all the experts are saying, they all agree with this change. It's actually seen as very good policy. Good policy, but I think a tough one, a politically tough one to implement. One that will, again, drive access to the housing market and also improve the budget bottom line and improve state budgets. Now, in our proposal, the Greens' federal proposal actually calls for a bridging finance scheme to allow the federal government to assist state governments to let this happen, and also making sure that in transitional arrangements, making sure that the scheme would only apply to new property sales and not those that have already paid stamp duty. The ACT, to give them credit, that's a Labor Greens government. They're actually 5 years into a 20-year plan to phase out stamp duty with land tax, and I think it really is now time for Victoria to seriously consider this proposal, and certainly for Victoria to get behind and really advocate for those changes at a federal level in terms of ending negative gearing. We've seen them enter the debate on a number of federal issues, a number of federal tax issues, and it'd be really good to see the Victorian government get behind those changes and advocate at the federal level and stand up for people who are wanting to buy their first home. Now, I can talk from personal experience, and certainly I'm not going to go into a woe is me story, because I think MPs are very well looked after, and I've been fortunate enough to be able to buy my first home. But some of the challenges I've faced may be emblematic and may be consistent about many people trying to buy their first home. I mean, I was looking for an apartment to raise my family, and I'm a big believer in people being able to raise families in apartments, and good high quality apartments. But in looking for an apartment to raise a family, essentially that rules out anything that was being built in the last 2 or 3 decades, because they simply aren't, the new apartments that are being built in the high towers simply aren't being made for families. But then when you do go to an auction, it's pretty easily to tell that all the new apartments that are coming onto the market are actually really designed for people to buy one day and then put on the rental market the next, really designed for investors. So we really do need to change what is, I think, fairly called a rigged system to favour new homeowners. The other issue I want to touch on is renters' rights. Now, about 60% of people living in the Prahran electorate are renters, and actually as part of the parliamentary intern program, I did have an intern, Miss Harriet Murphy, do a research report into stress in the Prahran electorate. And the survey was conducted, and it found a range of issues that people are experiencing in their rental properties, whether it's affordability issues, concerns about lease security, the apartments not being of acceptable standard, and there are a number of suggested improvements around protecting tenants, minimum standards, removing the grounds, eviction without grounds, looking at rent regulation and minimum lease durations, and looking at establishing a residential tenancy ombudsman. As part of the research, we did conduct a survey, and just some of the stories that people were telling us about their experience in renting. People being concerned, always worrying that their lease won't be renewed. For example, one person saying, my landlord declined my proposal to re-sign a 12-month lease, prefers month to months, and this makes me feel a little uncertain about my situation should they decide to sell or occupy. Renting with a pet, now that's an issue that I think goes very much unnoticed. One person states that renting with a pet is almost impossible. We had to give my husband's beloved cat to other family members because we couldn't find a property that would allow us to rent with a cat. Now this might seem like a small thing, but being able to have a pet in a house, obviously no pets are obviously members of the family, and if you have a whole bunch of properties on the rental market that don't allow pets, it really does exclude a whole bunch of properties from the rental market. Another issue is no grounds eviction, and this is a really, I think, an element in the Rental Tenancies Act that does need to be changed. In fact, the Greens have actually in previous parliaments moved a private member's bill to get rid of this provision because we have landlords potentially using this no grounds eviction provision rather than a grounds-based eviction to actually sidestep some of the grounds-based evictions processes and evicting people for reasons that they shouldn't be evicted. So this really is something that needs to be looked at, and I think there's the government's conducting a review into the Rental Tenancies Act. We see legislation today to provide for those longer-term leases, but there is so much more that can be done to improve the rights of renters and improve the lot of renters. Now, I do want to touch on also homelessness, because that is a very serious issue and a very growing issue. I really want to express my disappointment with the City of Melbourne and their approach to homelessness, making it easier, having new bylaws that makes it easier for homeless people to be moved on and for their property and what they sleep in to be confiscated. And these laws were opposed by the Greens on Melbourne City Council because it is just simply going to result in more people being homeless in other areas. That's just going to shift people out of the City of Melbourne. And I know there was a lot of complaints about homeless people gathering around Flinders Street Station. Some terrible reporting by the Herald Sun on that matter. But look, homeless people will gather in numbers for a sense of security, a sense of community, and also to bring attention to their cause. And we know in response to people gathering at Flinders Street Station that the governments did actually have to provide some sort of housing. So it's very disappointing that the City of Melbourne are taking that approach. I've been really fortunate to visit a number of housing service providers that serve the Prahran electorate. Sacred Heart Mission, where I was able to meet some service users while serving them breakfast. St Joseph Outreach, I attended their AGM the other day. They provide some transitional housing. Prahran Mission, who provide a range of services around mental health support. Launch Housing, who are really a key entry point for people experiencing homelessness. And all these services really express their concern with the stress, the increased amount of homelessness, the stress that's placing on their organisations. And I was really quite concerned to note that in accommodating people in crisis accommodation, there really is a lack of that within the Prahran area and around the local area, and people are having to be sent out to outer suburbs and country towns where there's no knowledge of whether that's a suitable or sustainable tenancy. They're away from their support networks, and many of these people simply just end up back at that same service. So there's something needs to be done. I mean, there simply really isn't enough housing all around, whether it's on the private market, whether it's in public housing, whether it's in crisis accommodation, and certainly more needs to be done. I'm really glad that I've established a really good connection with the folks that live at public housing in the Prahran electorate. We've had some really good wins for them, whether it's getting security doors put on that new building on Surrey Road that was built without security doors. So now they can feel secure in their own homes, or to open the door or have their door open on a hot day to let the breeze through. Really pleased to see the upgrade to the South Yarra kindergarten. That was a kindy that served some of our most disadvantaged kids, and that was in really a state of disrepair and completely unsuitable. So really I'm glad to see, following some advocacy there I did in Parliament, that has now been upgraded. There's still a bit more to do. There is a particular problem with pigeons on that estate and pigeon infestation. That needs to be seriously looked at. There is a number of upgrades that still need to occur. In fact, in one building, only I think the first 3 stories actually got upgraded some years ago, and there was a promise to upgrade them, but unfortunately that has never occurred. It was all put on ice for this Prahran renewal project that has been, a bit of work has been done. We actually haven't seen much action on that. But what is really needed in public housing is not only a big investment in the upgrades of existing public housing, but a really big investment in improving or increasing the amount of public housing out there. The waiting list is something around 35,000. We know from the Auditor General's report that the actual real demand is actually much higher. And so we need that big, really big investment in public housing that we saw many decades ago, because the current situation is simply not sustainable. And I'm really glad to see that we've got the Greens have got an inquiry going on into this public housing renewal project, which we've seen from previous projects. There really has been a number of issues. This supposed 10% increase as a result of selling off a whole bunch of public land, well, that simply is a drop in the ocean to what's really needed. And the big concern is if that's just simply the amount that's being offered, it really isn't enough, and it's really not an appropriate project. So what we really are, I'm really glad to see that we've got an inquiry going up into that. But ultimately, this housing crisis must be fixed. We really need that tax reform to fix that rigged housing system. We really do need to improve renters' rights, and we've got to have that massive investment in public housing and improve those services so people can stay in their tenancy. Inaction just simply isn't an option.